I've never been the type to believe in ghost stories. To me, these things have always been exaggerations or delusions of impressionable minds. At least that's what I thought, until the night I heard the first voice. It was a day, like any other. After a long day, I came home with that exhaustion that seems to suck every last drop of energy. The house, an old townhouse I had recently rented, was quiet and quiet, perhaps too quiet. The kind of place that could be described as full of character, with its wooden floors that creaked with every step and a slightly sweet smell of aged wood. It didn't take long for me to get used to the nocturnal cracks of the beams and the wind whispering through the cracks in the windows. I used to tell myself that it was all part of the charm. The house was a Victorian townhouse, over 100 years old, one of those that seemed to be stuck in another time. The details on the facade, with their tall windows and carved moldings, suggested a beauty that the passing of the years had turned to melancholy. Inside, the atmosphere was even more charged. The walls were lined with old papers that came loose in the corners, and the smell of old wood mixed with a slight dampness hung in the air. The ground floor had a faded charm. The living room, with heavy furniture and covered in worn fabrics, seemed to have been left intact since the last inhabitant had left. There was a stone fireplace that I had never lit, surrounded by empty bookshelves that held only the dust of the years. The corridor that led to the kitchen was lit by a single pendant lamp, whose yellowish light made the shadows dance on the walls. That night, however, something was different. It was after midnight when I heard it for the first time. A low sound, almost a whisper, coming directly from upstairs. At first I thought it was my imagination playing pranks, or maybe the wind finding some new crack in the house. But it wasn't. The sound had rhythm, intonation. It was a voice. "Is anyone here?" I asked, my voice shaking more than I care to admit. The silence that followed was so absolute that even my breathing seemed too high. I wanted to ignore it. I convinced myself that it was some banal noise from the house, something I just hadn't noticed before. But when I lay down, the sound came back, this time clearer. It was as if someone was talking, but the words were indistinct, like a distant hum. A coldness crept through my entire body, and sleep, which had once seemed inevitable, evaporated completely. Before we continue, I want to invite you to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and activate the bell. Stories like this are even more intense with his participation. Now, turn off the lights and turn up the volume, because things are going to get even weirder. The first voice I heard was not loud or threatening. In fact, it was almost subtle, as if someone wanted to be heard only by me. I could have sworn it came from a specific spot on the ceiling, right above my bed. The feeling was strange, as if the house itself was trying to communicate. I spent time staring at the ceiling, trying to understand, but the sound stopped. The silence was even more unsettling, as if patiently waiting for me to let my guard down. Finally, I decided to get out of bed. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and walked toward the stairs that led upstairs. The hallway was colder than the rest of the house, and the sound of my footsteps sounded absurdly loud against the wooden floor. As I climbed, I noticed something strange. The sound of the voice did not get louder, even with the approach. It was as if it were all around me, coming from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. When I reached the top of the stairs, everything was silent again. The light of the lantern illuminated the empty hallway, only closed doors and walls covered in shadows. For a moment I thought about opening the door to the master bedroom, which was at the back. But something stopped me. It was an intuition, an invisible weight that seemed to hold me in place. I decided to go down again, ignoring the chill that insisted on running through my body. Maybe I was just too tired. Maybe it was just the creaking house. At least that's what I wanted to believe that night. But it was the upstairs that really bothered me. Whenever I climbed those stairs, I felt as if I was invading a space that did not belong to me. The handrail was smooth, worn by hands that had passed by. The air was different up there, denser, colder. The silence was so absolute that every creak of the floor sounded like a scream. The rooms were almost empty, except for the occasional piece of furniture left behind. But there was something else about that place. Something I couldn't explain, but it was almost tangible. It was as if the walls held secrets, and each closed door hid a story that I was not supposed to hear. The upstairs was not just part of the house. It was a world apart, and I was beginning to believe that it had a life of its own. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that there was nothing wrong. Maybe it was just the sound of the wind, I thought. Old houses, like that, always had their peculiarities. The creaking of the floor, the crackling of the beams, everything could be explained if I just tried hard enough. But even as I repeated these justifications in my mind, a part of me didn't believe it. There was something about the way the sound resonated in that house. It wasn't random, it wasn't natural. Each whisper seemed charged with intent, as if it was directed specifically at me. Still, I refused to accept any explanation that was not rational. What would you say to others? That my house was trying to talk to me? That there was something hidden upstairs? No, that was ridiculous. So, I started testing my theories. I started to leave music playing at night, trying to drown out any strange sound. I walked around the house during the day, paying attention to the noises to find a pattern that could explain what was happening. But nothing seemed to work. The sound was still there, not constant, but always present, waiting for the right moment to catch me off guard. The more I tried to ignore it, the more evident it became that something was wrong. The nights became longer, filled with a tension that would not let me rest. And yet I refused to face what was right in front of me. After all, what could he do? Call someone? To say that I heard voices upstairs? Who would believe me? It was as if the house was testing me, waiting to see how far I would go before finally accepting what, deep down, I already knew. I decided to investigate more about the house. There was something there, something that seemed too old to ignore. I spent an entire morning in the city library, flipping through old records and newspapers. It was then that I discovered something that made me freeze. The house had been built in the late 19th century by a man named Elias Cartwright, a wealthy and, from what I read, somewhat eccentric merchant. He lived there with his wife and 2 children, but in 1912 the entire family disappeared without a trace. The newspapers of the time spoke of investigations that never led to anything. Some said they ran away, others muttered something more sinister. What bothered me the most was a strange detail. Neighbors reported hearing sounds coming from the house weeks after the disappearance, as if the family was still there. When she returned home, that oppressive feeling seemed even more intense. Every detail, every noise, seemed to carry a new weight now that I knew what had happened there. I began to notice small things that I had previously ignored. Marks on the floor, as if furniture had been dragged. An old closet in the master bedroom that was always ajar, no matter how many times I closed it. It was as if the house was telling me its story, little by little, fragmented, waiting for me to put the pieces together. That night, after closing the closet for the 3rd time, I sat on the couch in the living room, trying to process everything. The darkness felt heavier than usual, and every sound was amplified by my tension. That was when I heard the voice again. It was no longer a whisper, but a call, my name, spoken clearly. I dropped the book I was holding, my hands trembling. I took a deep breath and decided that I would not go up at that moment. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow I'll sort it out. But I knew, deep down, that this tomorrow would be more terrifying than I could imagine. The next morning, the sunlight brought a brief sense of relief. The sound of the voices had stopped for a few hours, or at least that's what I thought. I prepared a strong coffee and tried to convince myself that it was all the result of my tiredness. Maybe I was just paranoid. After all, who would hear voices in the silence of an old house without starting to question their sanity? Leave it in the comments if you would also question yourself. But as the day wore on, the house seemed to come alive again. Objects seemed to be out of place. The closet door I had closed the night before was open again, wide open as if mocking me. Around noon, I began to hear noises coming from upstairs, not whispers this time, but a slight dragging, as if something were moving across the floor. The following nights were a real test of nerves. The sounds, which had previously been sporadic, began to repeat with a disturbing frequency. What had once been an occasional whisper now felt like a prolonged conversation, with pauses and returns. I didn't understand the words, but I could feel the emotion in them, a mixture of despair and anger, as if something or someone was trying to warn or confront me. I started to hear footsteps too. Heavy and slow, they made their way upstairs, coming and going down the hallway. Every creak of the floor made my heart race. At times, it felt like the footsteps stopped high above me, as if something was watching me from the ceiling. The worst thing was that every time I mustered up the courage to go up and check, the silence returned, relentless and overwhelming. There was a night when the sounds went beyond. I was sitting on the couch, trying to distract myself with a book, when I heard something that made my blood run cold, a low, almost childlike laugh echoing down the upstairs hallway. There was nothing joyful about that laughter. It was cold, sharp, and seemed to carry a promise of something I didn't want to discover. My sanity was starting to crumble. I started sleeping with the lights on, keeping the cell phone in my hand as if that could protect me. With each new sound, the house seemed to be closing in on me, reducing the few spaces that still made me feel safe. It was as if she were alive, pulsating with a dark energy that fed on my fear. And I knew that sooner or later, I would have to face whatever was upstairs. The night that followed was unlike any other. Sounds were no longer restricted upstairs. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something scratch at my bedroom door. It was a faint but steady sound, like fingernails scratching at wood. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, still trying to convince myself that it was just the wind or some animal that had entered the house. I took a deep breath, gathered my courage, and went to the door. The light in the hallway was off, but the sound continued, lower now. I opened the door slowly, the flashlight of the cell phone shaking in my hand. The hallway was empty, but there was something on the floor, marks, as if something had been dragged toward the stairs. I followed those marks, each step a test for my self-control. When I reached the top of the stairs, I heard the sound again, this time coming from one of the rooms. My body told me to go back, to lock the door and forget everything, but something bigger pushed me forward. I opened the door from which the sound was coming, and, for a brief moment, I thought I saw a shadow move. But when the light of the flashlight illuminated the room, there was nothing there. Just the old closet ajar again. That's when the closet door opened on its own, slowly, with a long, agonizing creak. Something fell from inside, rolling across the floor until it stopped at my feet. It was an old doll, with glass eyes that seemed to stare at me. And then, the voice came again, clear and unmistakable. "Why are you here?" My reaction was instinctive. I took 2 steps back, almost stumbling, as the flashlight trembled in my hand. The doll remained motionless, but the weight of that question resounded in the empty room. I don't know," I murmured, as if I hoped she could hear. The air felt thicker, heavier, and every fiber of my being screamed to get out of there. But before I could move, another sound rang out, a faint, distant laugh coming from the hallway. The laughter seemed childish, but there was nothing innocent about it. It was as if the house was having fun at my expense. I took a step toward the door, but before I could get out, the flashlight flashed and went out. I stood in the dark, my breath echoing in the heavy silence of the room. So, I felt it. I didn't see it, but I felt something close, a presence, a sudden change in the air. It was as if the space around me was being taken over by something I couldn't comprehend. With trembling fingers, I managed to turn the flashlight back on. The light illuminated the empty room, but the doll was no longer on the floor. My gaze searched for her frantically, until I saw her again, now sitting on the bed. Her position had changed, and she seemed to lean forward, her eyes fixed on me. My instinct screamed to run, and that's what I did. I stumbled down the stairs, the sound of my own footsteps drowning out any other noise. In the living room, I sat on the couch, trying to catch my breath. The adrenaline was still rushing through my body, and I knew I couldn't sleep without help. I went to the kitchen and took 2 sleeping pills, something I avoided, but that night seemed to be the only solution. Even so, the tension did not subside. Back in the room, I locked the door and pushed a chair against it. I lay on the bed, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, while I waited for the effect of the medicines. The silence was overwhelming, but it was better than hearing the laughter or that voice. Gradually, exhaustion took hold of me, and my body began to give in. Even so, before I fell asleep, I had the distinct feeling that something was standing outside the room waiting. The sun rose, bringing an illusory calm. As the hot coffee filled the room with a comforting aroma, I tried to convince myself that what had happened the night before was a reflection of tiredness and pressure. It was easy to rationalize everything in the light of day. The shadows seemed less threatening, and the nocturnal sounds, now absent, became distant memories. But deep down I knew something was wrong. The house didn't let me forget. I started the day as usual, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. But with each step down the hallway, an unsettling sensation crept across my skin, as if the very air was charged with intent. As I passed the stairs leading upstairs, my gaze was drawn to the top. The silence was overwhelming, but even more disturbing was what wasn't there. The void. The events of the night before still hovered in my mind, especially that glass-eyed doll. I had left her in bed, unable to touch her again. Now I needed to see if she was still there. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my weight as if the house wanted to announce my presence. When he reached the room, the door was ajar, swaying slightly as if it had been moved by a breeze. An impossible breeze, considering that all the windows were closed. With a trembling hand, I pushed the door open. The room was empty, but the doll was no longer on the bed. My heart raced. I searched the room, trying to find any sign that this was a joke in my mind. It was then that I noticed something in the built-in closet. The door, previously only ajar, was now wide open. Inside, at the back, the doll was sitting with its head slightly tilted to the side, as if watching me. I left the room quickly, closing the door tightly. My breathing was quickened, and my chest felt like it was about to explode. At that moment, I realized that the house was playing with me. Every movement, every sound, seemed calculated to destabilize me. It was as if she wanted me to know that I was at a disadvantage. Back downstairs, I sat down on the couch and tried to organize my thoughts. My vision fell on the book I had left on the table. I flipped through its pages once again, looking for answers. One section caught my eye: conductive objects. The text explained that, in places considered haunted, certain objects could act as anchors for entities or energies. The doll, she wasn't just an old toy, it was something more. That night, I locked all the doors and windows, including the one in the room where the doll was. But even so, I could no longer feel safe. As I tried to sleep, I heard it again. First, there was the sound of light footsteps in the upstairs hallway. Then the sound changed to something more unsettling, a low, almost muffled laugh, as if she was having fun with my fear. I closed my eyes tightly, trying to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks. But then a clear, distinct sound came from the next room, a child's voice, whispering with a disturbing sweetness, "You can't ignore me forever." The next morning, moved by the growing sense of danger, I decided to go into the room where the doll had been found. It wasn't just any place. Something in that space seemed to pulsate with an energy that I couldn't ignore. I mustered up the courage and grabbed an iron bar that I kept in the basement to defend myself in case something happened. I knew that investigating could be dangerous, but doubt was consuming me. As I opened the built-in cabinet once more, I found marks on the bottom of the wood. Not simple scratches, but engraved symbols that formed a disconcerting pattern. The marks looked old, as if they had been there for decades, and were accompanied by a metallic smell, similar to that of oxidized iron. I decided to push the wood from the back of the cabinet, moved by an inexplicable impulse. With effort, the plate gave way, revealing a hidden opening. Behind her, a cramped, dark space stretched out like a tunnel that seemed to have no end. It was cold inside, and the air carried a smell of moisture mixed with something sweet and nauseating. Before I could make any decision, I heard the sound. It wasn't the laughter of before, but something deeper, a collective whisper that seemed to come from inside the tunnel. "Come," said the voices, in a disturbing harmony. My mind told me to step back, but my feet seemed to move on their own, drawn by an unseen force. Suddenly, I felt something touch my shoulder. I turned around quickly, but there was no one there. The cold in the hallway increased, and the feeling of being watched became unbearable. I covered the entrance to the tunnel with the closet door, pushing furniture against it, as if that could contain whatever was inside. I ran downstairs and sat on the couch, my heart beating wildly. The revelation of what was in the closet left me more confused than ever. What was that tunnel? Why did it seem to call for me? More importantly, what had I awakened when I moved there? I knew I needed answers, but more than ever I dreaded the questions I was about to ask. That night, the house seemed more alive than ever. Every creak of the walls, every breath of wind through the cracks of the windows carried an evil intent. I had plugged the tunnel, but I knew that was not enough. Sitting on the couch, with the lights all on, I tried to keep my mind busy, but the feeling of being watched was constant. Around midnight, the footsteps began again. At first light, almost like a soft touch on the floor, but as the minutes passed, they became firmer, closer. The footsteps were not erratic. They followed a rhythm, as if someone were deliberately walking upstairs. I took my cell phone and approached the stairs. Each step felt like an abyss, and the sound of footsteps ceased as soon as I set foot on the first step. The tension was overwhelming. Is anyone there? My voice sounded weaker than I expected, breaking the oppressive silence. Nothing answered, but the air seemed to pulsate with something invisible, a presence I couldn't ignore. I decided to go up, guided by the flashlight of my cell phone. Each step was a test of courage, and with each step, the feeling of being watched increased. When I arrived in the hallway, the air was cold, and a sweet, metallic smell filled the room. The bedroom door was open, and the doll, once left in the closet, was now sitting in the middle of the hallway, its eyes fixed on me. I wanted to retreat, but something pushed me forward. When I took the first step toward the doll, it fell to the side, as if it had been pushed by invisible hands. A laugh echoed down the hallway, this time louder, sharper, coming from all sides. Then the lights upstairs went out. I stood in the dark, my heart racing, while my cell phone lit up only a small fraction of the hallway. Who's there? My voice trembled, and I knew I would get no answer. The silence was broken by a new sound, something dragging, as if claws were scratching the wooden floor. The light on the cell phone flickered for a moment, and when it came back, I saw something move at the far end of the hallway. It was a tall, shapeless shadow, faceless, but with a presence that seemed to fill the entire space. It moved slowly, its contours floating like smoke. My instinct told me to run, but my legs didn't respond. It was as if the floor had turned into cement. The shadow stopped next to the fallen doll, and I felt something cold and heavy invade my mind, a feeling of invasion that made me dizzy. Why did you pave the way? The voice echoed directly in my head, deep and vibrant. I wanted to answer, but my throat was dry, and the words just wouldn't come. The light from the cell phone went out completely, and the corridor plunged into absolute darkness. So, I felt it. Cold, thin, long hands grabbed my arm. A scream escaped my throat as I struggled, trying to free myself. My hands suddenly let go, and I fell backwards, down the first few steps of the stairs. My flashlight came back on impact, illuminating the empty hallway. The doll was no longer there, and the shadow had disappeared. I ran downstairs, ignoring the pain in my body, and locked myself in the room. My hands trembled as I piled furniture against the door, as if it could protect me from whatever was up there. The house was silent again, but the air felt heavier than ever, charged with an overwhelming energy. I sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, and looked up at the ceiling, where I now heard small whispers. They were not clear, but repeated, forming a kind of hypnotic chant. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sound, but it only intensified inside my head. The sense that something bigger, older was manifesting was undeniable. Then, the door to the room shook slightly. A faint scratch ran through the wood, followed by a slow, rhythmic beat. I knew I couldn't ignore it forever. Something had been awakened, and now it was at my door, waiting for the right moment to enter. The knock on the door became stronger, rhythmic, as if something wanted to test my endurance. My heart felt like it was about to come out of my chest as I held a kitchen knife, the only object I could pick up in the panic. "Go away," I shouted, my voice echoing through the empty room. But the answer came, not in words, but in a rising pressure in the air, as if the house itself were breathing around me. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered wildly. A deep, almost guttural sound reverberated through the walls. The door opened slowly, despite the furniture blocking it, and a shadow began to form in the entrance. It was tall, amorphous, with claw-like extremities extending in all directions. The temperature in the room plummeted, and my breath came out in clouds of steam. "You shouldn't have messed with what you don't understand," the voice said, not audible, but directly in my mind. It was cold, sharp, and seemed to carry a weight of ages. The shadow inched in, the furniture being pushed as if it were paper. The knife in my hand seemed insignificant, but it was all I had. In an act of desperation, I ran towards the fireplace and lit the fire. I picked up a burning piece of wood and pointed to the figure. "Stay away." My voice was a mixture of fear and determination. The shadow hesitated for a moment, but then moved forward, as if my attempt at resistance was a provocation. The figure was almost over me when I heard a sound that was not coming from me or the entity. It was the tunnel. The sound of voices echoed from there, louder and louder, like a chorus of lamentation and anger. The shadow turned to the sound, as if it was being called back. I took advantage of the distraction and threw the burning wood towards the figure. She recoiled, not out of fear, but as if she was being sucked into the energy emanating from the tunnel. With a last scream of pure anger, the shadow disappeared, and the room fell silent. My body collapsed to the floor, exhausted, while the fire in the fireplace was the only light left. I knew that it wasn't over. Whatever was in the house was still there, lurking, waiting for another moment of weakness. Dawn brought fragile relief. The sunlight that came in through the cracks in the windows seemed less real, almost as if it were an illusion. The house was quiet, but I knew its tranquility was deceptive. Nothing inside her was normal now. Perhaps it never had been. I spent the morning hastily gathering my belongings. Every noise seemed like a warning. Every shadow made me turn quickly, waiting for the figure to return. As I put my bags in the car, I looked one last time at the house. Their windows looked like empty eyes, watching me leave with calculated stillness. I thought I'd alert someone, maybe the police, or even some expert on supernatural phenomena. But who would believe me? All I had were distorted memories, and a fear that seemed to eat away at every rational thought. As I started the car and started to walk away, an unsettling thought came over me. What if I hadn't left that behind? What if something had followed me? The rearview mirror reflected the house, getting smaller, but something made me look again. For a split second, I swore to see a dark figure in the bedroom window, watching as I drove away. The cold ran down my spine, but I didn't stop. All I could do was keep driving, hoping that the distance would be enough to keep me safe. To this day, I don't know what really happened in that house. I didn't go back for answers, and I may never go back. But at night, in moments of absolute silence, I still hear that distant whisper, calling my name. Did you like this story? Don't forget to like the video to help us continue bringing you these chilling stories. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new stories, and share them with your friends who love the supernatural. Which part of the story scared you the most? Leave your comment below. We want to know what you think.